Hello, this is David Beeston welcoming you to Chapter 4 of A History of Spain, entitled A Revolution. We're going to be dealing with one of the greatest revolutions the world has seen, certainly far more beneficial for Europe and perhaps indeed for the whole of mankind than the American Revolution, the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. Now, I know that we promised you some time ago that we would be dealing with two great cultures that emerged in prehistoric Iberia. And last week we talked about one of them. That was El Argar and its supporting act and predecessor, Los Miares. They were both in the east of Spain. We still have the second great culture to deal with. That was Tartessos down in the south. But between El Argar and Tartessos, there was a long intervening period without any single great centralizing and controlling power, and that deserves a little attention too. What's more, by the end of that period, there was an extraordinary encounter, an extraordinarily important encounter, between the Iberian peoples and people from way across the Mediterranean. We need to understand them and that encounter better before we get on to Tartessos, whose rise to glory was very much based on it. That's going to be our subject for this week. Before we get on to that, though, I'd like to ask you for a quick favour, which would greatly help this podcast. If you're not already a follower, could you please become one? It's free, and all you have to do is click on the follow button on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Many thanks, and now back to the episode. Not far from where we live, in the province of Valencia, there's a hill called the Lloma de Betxí. Its top is occupied by the remains of a settlement which was inhabited, archaeologists assure us, between 1800 and 1300 BCE. That's before the Common Era. That means it was still being occupied for a couple of hundred years, 250 years, after the collapse of the El Argar culture. It's solidly built with high stone walls, certainly higher than me, but then I'm not terribly tall. When I first saw the place, I thought the walls looked like fortifications and that I was looking at something like a fortress. The archaeologists assure us that this is not the case, that this was in fact a homestead, a farm, occupied by an extended family. It could probably have taken 60 or 70 people, perhaps even more, but in all likelihood was occupied by 40 or 50 at any given moment. The sides of the hill on which it was built were terraced, and that suggests that the people there were growing crops on the hill itself. There's even a water cistern suggesting that they would fill it with water from the river, which is only a few minutes' walk away, rather suggesting that one of the worst tasks for adolescents in the Lloma de Betxí was probably being told to nip down to the river and collect a couple of buckets of water to pour into the cistern at a time when rainwater wasn't keeping it full. Archaeologists found plenty of traces of the inhabitants of the place. There were grinding stones to grind grain, there was an oven, and there were ceramic bowls and pots. What this all shows is that the collapse of El Argar didn't plunge the whole of Iberia into a dark age, but that there were communities like La Lloma de Betxí that continued to prosper and thrive. Why did it end? Well, there are traces on the sides of the walls of fire, and it's possible that the place actually burnt. After that, maybe the younger people and the kids left the farmstead. Not everyone, it seems, left, however. Archaeologists have found a grave there containing the skeletons of two older people from after the period of the fire. That leads to a rather bleak aspect of the end of the community, suggesting that these older people perhaps felt they couldn't uproot themselves from their home at their age and stayed there until, rather sadly, they died as its last inhabitants. Still, they can't have been completely isolated or cut off from their families because, after all, someone came back to bury their bodies. Lloma de Betxí is an example of the communities that carried right on as before, even after the collapse of El Argar. It was very far from the only such example, and indeed agriculture, which is what its main practice was, wasn't the only activity that just went on uninterrupted. Another was metalwork, which had done so much to make El Argar prosperous and powerful. Take, for example, the prehistoric village of Peñalosa, which archaeologists have explored in the province of Jaén in northeastern Andalucía. It clings to the side of a hill and is terraced to support both housing and workshops, which are closely integrated with each other, suggesting that people were working at home, though I don't suppose this has much in common with what we now call working from home. Among the findings in the village are considerable traces of continuing metalwork well past Argaric times. They cover every stage in the process. Slag was found, slag being the waste residue produced by the smelting process used to separate metal from the mineral ore with which it is mined. Archaeologists have also found crucibles and furnaces. In addition, there were metal objects or fragments of them. So it's very clear that in Peñalosa, as in other villages, that kind of work continued too, just as farming had continued at Lloma de Betxí. An even more striking example of continuity of working with metal is provided by the mines in Huelva, in the very west of Andalucía on the border with Portugal. Mining continues there today, though these days it's mostly open cast. The ore is dug out of huge pits in the ground. Today it's mostly copper ore with small amounts of other minerals. Back then it was both copper and silver, and the mining took place in the way most of us would picture it, that is, with miners working underground. Nor was there any loss in skill of the metalworkers. Bronze objects have survived, both weapons such as swords and tools, and there is also fine jewellery, including some excellent work in gold. So much for continuity, though. There was also in this period a first encounter which was going to have profound effects transforming Iberian society. Not that Iberia would be alone in this. The same kind of change with the same roots would be happening throughout Europe. To understand how that encounter happened and to understand what its impact would be, we need to travel some distance across the whole of the Mediterranean. Picture a long, narrow coastal plain between the sea and the mountains. On it stand three great cities, Byblos, Sidon and Tyre, making what came to be known as the Phoenician world. Today they're all in Lebanon. At the time we're talking about, it was Tyre, with its fine buildings and its great harbour, that was becoming preeminent because of its drive to extend its trade and its influence right across the Mediterranean. The sea provided a source of wealth in the form of a ugly-sounding, carnivorous sea snail, from which by an evil-smelling process it was possible to extract a purple dye. This was a highly desired commodity, and it was eye-wateringly expensive. The mountains produced high-quality wood, in particular cedar. The Phoenicians used that wood to build excellent vessels, incorporating all the latest technological advances in shipbuilding. That included keels to maintain stability even in stormy weather, and sharpened prows to cut through the water more quickly and more effectively. The Phoenicians also mastered celestial navigation, which meant they could also travel by night, navigating by the stars, instead of having to hug the coasts to work out where they were. Their fast ships and skill in navigation meant that the sea wasn't just a source of unpleasant snails from which a costly dye could be made, but also a major highway, and the Phoenicians took it, trading all round the Mediterranean. They didn't just travel and trade. As part of their commercial policy, they also set up colonies. These would be trading stations from which they could operate and where they could store goods that they were going to sell into those territories or re-export to other parts of the Mediterranean. Of all those colonies, the greatest by far was Carthage. It was in what is now Tunisia, not far from Tunis. You're going to discover that one of my recurring themes is going to be how unimaginative we as humans are when it comes to naming places. Most of the initial inhabitants of Carthage came from Tyre. That to them was their old city, and they could think of nothing better as a name for the new settlement than to call it New City, which is what Carthage means in Phoenician. The new city would soon grow phenomenally rich and phenomenally powerful and overtake the Phoenicia from which it came as a dominant player in the Western Mediterranean. This wouldn't be the only example of that kind of phenomenon. After all, let's remember that 2.5 millennia later, a series of colonies founded by Britain in North America would, after getting their independence, grow to overtake and overshadow their mother country. What were the Phoenicians carrying in their ships as they set out to trade across their world, the Mediterranean? Well, they'd actually be carrying not just dye, but also the very cedar wood from which their ships were built and which was much prized in other countries. They also carried fine finished products, ceramics, glass, jewellery, some of it made by themselves, some of it made by others, some of it made by themselves but influenced by others. The British Museum in London holds a fine Phoenician bowl decorated with Egyptian motifs. But none of these were the epoch-changing contribution the Phoenicians would make to the European world. That was something far more profound. The Phoenicians were a Semitic people, like Arabs or Jews today. A group of Semitic peoples, the cousins of the Phoenicians if you like, lived in Sinai from where they travelled regularly into Egypt to work or trade. There they came across the Egyptian writing system. This was hieroglyphics, as you probably know, and hieroglyphs are notoriously difficult to master. That's because they're stylized pictures of things representing whole words or, sometimes, sequences of 3 consonants, but never individual sounds. Now, learning such a system would be easy if you only had to learn 3. If you had to learn 10, you'd probably find that not too difficult. If you moved to 50, that might be a little harder, but after all, it's only 24 more than the 26 letters we learn with our alphabet. When it gets to 250, it starts to become much more painful. At 500, I imagine most of us who are used to our alphabetic system would find it a pretty daunting prospect. And 500 is less than halfway to the total number of hieroglyphs you would need to be able to read. Now, these characters from the Sinai had an excellent idea. They thought those hieroglyphs mostly represent a single word. So why don't we take one of those hieroglyphs to represent the word in our language. Take, for instance, the Egyptian hieroglyph for a house, which looks a bit like a floor plan. It was adapted by the people from Sinai into something not altogether dissimilar, but instead of associating it with the Egyptian word for house, which was something like per, and I apologize to any ancient Egyptians listening to this for the way I pronounced that, they associated it with their own Semitic word for house, which was beit. Again, I apologize for the mispronunciation. Next came the really clever step, because they decided that the symbol that they'd created would not simply mean house. It would represent the first sound in their word for house. That first sound in beit was what we now call B. And so you had a letter. The Phoenicians, fellow Semites of the Sinai people, adopted the system from them. They turned the letter for B from beit to bet and included it as the second letter in a set of 22. That didn't include vowels, by the way. Semitic languages don't generally need to write vowels. Advanced readers can deduce them from the context when they read consonants, which often come in clusters of 3. That clustering, by the way, is something we'll come back to later. The Greeks, who were next door to the Phoenicians at the time, massively impressed by a system of just 22 characters to represent all words, took over the system for themselves. But they then added the missing vowels. They kept the equivalent of B, bet, as their own second letter, beta, but they added before it the first of these new vowels, alpha, corresponding to what we now call A. That gave the name that we now use for all these systems of letters, the alphabet. Just to complete the picture, the Greek alphabet was later modified to support Western European languages and became the 26-character Roman alphabet that we know and love today. This would be the greatest contribution the Phoenicians would make to world civilization. Funnily enough, the Greeks would take their word for book, biblion, from one of those great Phoenician cities, Byblos. This was less for its contribution to developing the letters as for the fact that it was the major source of papyrus on which people wrote. So it's still associated with writing, even if not directly the alphabet. That does mean, though, that we pay an unconscious tribute to those great Phoenician contributors to the art of writing when we use words like bibliophile in English, or indeed the word for library in Spanish, which is biblioteca, or indeed in German, French, or Italian, where it's something very similar. Indeed, the word Bible has the same root. And it's not just the Greek or Roman alphabets that we owe to the Phoenicians. We owe them the Russian Cyrillic alphabet, the Arabic alphabet, indeed, alphabets from all over Europe and the Middle East. That's a pretty remarkable achievement for the Phoenicians, wouldn't you agree? Revolutionary is perhaps not too strong a word. The impact of the Phoenicians on European culture and through it on world culture would be massive and long-lasting. The Phoenicians came into contact with the Iberians in around 900 BCE. That encounter would have a colossal effect on Iberian history and transform it radically. The work that the Iberians had continued to do in post-Argaric times, both in agriculture but above all in such fields as metalwork, prepared them to receive the Phoenicians and to take advantage of all the influence they could bring to bear. That's what would make Tartessos such a magnificent culture. We'll be talking about that next week. In the meantime, Many thanks for listening.